So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another round in the ongoing tournament. And I think I'm going to, in the future when I'm covering this tournament, only do the deciding pitch battle, aside from maybe the grand final where I will probably try to show all of the battles involved with it. Mainly because it's a little bit easier to gain a little bit more of a grasp on the tournament as a whole if I only do the deciding battle of each round. It makes it a little bit easier for me to actually keep tabs on the tournament as it happens. So I think that's what we will be doing moving forward. So the last battle that we showed actually was the deciding pitch battle, as it turns out, between Sprints and Buzzard and Tommy and T.S. Niehoff. So we're going to be doing that. I think this is also the same for this particular battle as well, between another 4 players today, and it's going to be KURO and SYNN who are going to be seeing the battle from the perspective of. It is interesting actually that so far the pitch battles that we've seen have been losses for the blue team, which is interesting. We shall see if that proves to be the case here. And also this is a very different setup. In the past 2 rounds we've seen a fair amount of quality centric factions. Here though, SYNN playing as Numenor, the only example of such a thing, because all 3 of the other factions today are Orcish factions with plenty of numbers at their back as well. So this is going to be an interesting little matchup here. You can see the blue team deploying a little bit further back in a much tighter formation in comparison to the Reds, who have really tried to use their numbers to spread across the entirety of the Frozen Lake bed. Another pitch battle map available for the tournament. So we'll start off with KURO's army playing as Mordor. Good army to have numbers, but also have that quality at the centre. When you're talking about trying to engage in a pitch battle as well, Mordor will be more readily punished for going only quality, which they are very often tempted to do in siege battles, but they can still pad their army out with a few orc fodder here. Obviously very low end, they're going to be killed off by most other units in melee, but considering it's orcish opposition they're going up against today, they will have equivalent effectively cannon fodder units on the other side of the field, so it's not necessarily that they're just here to get slaughtered on this one occasion, but we'll see. Uruk halberdiers in behind them as well. Obviously orcish factions, if they can have a bit of a phalanx backstop to their cannon fodder, it makes it just that little bit more well-rounded, a little bit more difficult to get through as well. But the same is going to be true certainly of the Misty Mountains on this side of the battlefield, and also Angmar, of course, with access to pikes, makes the waters a little bit muddier for Mordor if it comes down to that sort of thing later on. Heavy spears in the Morgul Chosen guarding the flank, and also being a very resilient unit. Mordor, of course, do need that extra defensive quality on the front line to keep things tied together nicely, and the Morgul Chosen are often the unit used for doing that. And in a pitch battle like this as well, of course, the anti-cavalry nature of the spears also becomes a bit more important. Troll drummers, who now function as intended, unlike in the last patch of the game, so orc factions are going to be leaning on them fairly regularly, I think, especially when you're going for a lower quality front line. It means that they're going to stay fighting for a little bit longer, which is ultimately all you want your front line to be doing. The rest of the Mordor army are going to have to be claiming victory. Olag High as well, they're going to have the edge in terms of troll combat here, Mordor. Olag High are stronger than anything that the Misty Mountains and Angmar have in sustained melee. Very, very powerful, of course. Troll class units, we've seen the Entwives as well, a similar thing. Monstrous infantry in general, a really big weapon that can be utilised, but both Angmar and the Misty Mountains do have the tools to deal with them. High damage and armour piercing still the way that you're going to want to be trying to deal with the trolls and cavalry charges as well. So we'll see if the Olag High can get in and amongst things and start supplementing that lower end front line. Orc javelins, cheap javelins for the orcs, always going to be a big part of how they try to do their business, pitch or siege battle. And just in behind we also have the Uruk chieftains, I believe still armour piercing, which is an important distinction in a matchup like this because it gives them a bit of an edge over something like the equivalent goblin unit, for example. They don't have the same level of pure infantry quality at the high end that Angmar do, but Mordor have more specialist options, which we will see over here as well. We saw the Mumakil last time out actually not be too decisive in the end, but the mere threat of having an elephant class unit like this forces your opponent to act in certain ways, and if they spread themselves too thin, it can be really difficult to deal with this sort of thing. The Beasts of Gorgoroth individually are not as resilient as the Mumakil though, not by a long shot, but their numbers do mean that if you can keep them moving, they can actually cause maybe even more chaos if, again, the margins are quite fine there. Ardenheim shadow bows, I was wondering if we would see a bit of Mordor archer action, because certainly I think the blue team are going to have better archer options than the reds. The Misty Mountains and Angmar together perhaps are the weakest long-range factions that the game has to offer, though both have got other ranged options when they get a little bit closer. We'll see them, I'm sure. More Morgul chosen on the flank, and also the Melkor's Abominations. Most Orcish factions will tend to try to prioritise blunting the enemy cavalry first and foremost with anti-cavalry cavalry options, and the Melkor's Abominations are certainly an example of that, but it's a bit like fighting fire with fire really. Both sides are probably going to be going about their business in much the same way. Even Numenor are more melee cavalry focused than shock. Orc fodder, and then the mighty Nazgul at the centre of things as well. They could be silent heroes in this battle, as they often prove to be. Now then, SYNN as Numenor occupies a pretty unique spot in the sense that they are undoubtedly a quality faction, so they have to go for this sort of approach. Numenorian steel bows, armour piercing if they can focus fire on individual targets, particularly from Angmar on this side of the field. That could really help them. They're also pretty damn decent in melee as well. The trebuchet of Numenor, so we've got the hammer infantry in amongst them as well. An artillery duel would be interesting, because we have seen in the distance that the Misty Mountains have brought their unique artillery piece. The trebuchets, and just in general, the artillery hasn't been the be-all and end-all in these pitch battles, but it's certainly shaped how players have moved. So we'll see if Numenor can get the value that they need, honestly, off their artillery. Numenorian cohort, obviously very, very powerful mainline infantry units. The extra attacking edge means that even Angmar, with their very robust infantry force, are going to be a little bit cautious when it comes to just straight up engaging with Numenor. They'll try and wrap around them with numbers, I'm sure, and then of course the Numenorian shield guard as well. Very, very good high-end spears. Also in and amongst things, we have the Axe Guard of Armenelos, the only completely new unit to Numenor in this version of the game, I think. Other than unit model changes and such at the lower end, but they are a good choice here. Armour piercing always going to be useful against the Orcish factions, but especially against Angmar, where they really do lay the armour on thick to try and get the most out of their effectiveness, so two-handed axemen are a good way to deal with that. A few units of the Seafarers of Niendamos as well, good javelins, and then also they can muck in melee later on should the need arise, and that damage, that close range punch, is something they're going to want to use. And the Lords of Anadune as well, another really good example of anti-cavalry cavalry, not only very good in melee, but also javelin cavalry. So it's the sort of thing which they can kite and then engage with. There may be a few hidden units as well, but a good spread there between Mordor and Numenor. Meanwhile, Angmar over here, played by Katragon. Angmar and the Misty Mountains are going to have some overlap in their approach. Warg Riders, basic though they may be, numbers of cavalry here look already to be in the favour of the Reds, and just in general I think the blue team are going to be a little bit more defensive, try and huddle up a little bit more, and the red team are going to try and spread out and envelop them. The cavalry will certainly help them do that. The Witch Realm Inquisitors as well means that they're going to have the quality to be able to do that. With 3 cav units, it's going to be very difficult for the Numenor Jav cav to actually be able to kite them around, because with some good finagling with your micro, the wargs should have what it takes to wrap them up. Some upgraded Witch Realm pikemen, of course, no other pikes on the field by the looks of things, not even from Numenor. It would be a fairly expensive endeavour, and they've decided to go for some artillery instead of maybe packing on some Naru Naru Sentinels or even some Belagaya pikes. Not only that, but they also have the Angmar halberds in behind, far cheaper of course, less range, but armour piercing, and a combination of the two could be pretty damn useful. We'll see. They need to get into melee and establish themselves. Angmar, of course, also have the supporting heavy infantry, which will allow them to do that. No armour upgrade on the Guardians of Khan Doom, though. Electing instead to try and bulk up their pikes a little bit. There actually isn't that many archers, so they may well have actually been better placed putting the armour upgrade onto the Guardians of Khan Doom, because they're going to be in harm's way more directly than the pikes will with that extra range, but it's splitting hairs, that really. The Guardians of Khan Doom will be moving forward and ultimately trying to shield the phalanx units in behind. The Hammer Guard, armour piercing, of course, it's going to be useful both ways this time around, unlike in the last pitch battle we saw, especially against Numenor, you'd have to say. You know, with how high quality they are, you need to try and knock them down a peg or two somehow. The Hammer Guard, an ideal unit for trying to do that with, and some Trolls as well, so some Trolls of Angmar, not quite up to the same level as the Olag High, but we've seen them be very effective in the past, and of course getting them in and amongst the Numenor lines, especially trying to go after that trebuchet with their mass, might be the key here. No archers though, so cavalry combined with a sweeping infantry offensive is what we're probably going to be seeing here. Less clear over on this side, one artillery piece apiece. We've got SAI PHANI over here, who is going to be using the Goblin War Engine, the Mangonel. I mean, this, even more so than most artillery, is a little bit wild and wacky. You don't know quite what you're going to get from it, but with how sort of condensed the blue team actually are, a few quick fire shots on the Mangonel could be really, really devastating here early on, so we'll see. It could pay off immediately. Heavy Goblin crossbows, they can get themselves situated, much in the same way as the steel bows. They have more ammunition, but the chance to use all of it is probably going to be limited in a pitch battle like this, so they need to get themselves situated and start focusing down high-value targets, and there's no shortage of them from Mordor or Numenor. More phalanx units and the Moria Halberdiers and the White Uruk Fearmongers, so a clear tilt towards that style of game for the Reds here. Black Uruks of the Mountains are an interesting force to bring up as the supporting units, but probably the right one, purely because of the lack of archers from the blue team, or at least lack of archer numbers. They will still be vulnerable to stuff like the Ardenheim shadow bows, but they will be more effective in melee. They will be certainly more of a problem for the lower quality units that Mordor have available to them. And then we also have some Warg skirmishers, so some javelin cavalry on the red side, the Bolg's champions and more Wargs, and then the Goblin Kingsguard here at the back as well. So I think it's really going to be a case of, is this cavalry going to pay off, and are they going to be able to envelop the blues, or will the blue team manage to hold out? Without further ado, let's get this show on the road. I mean, in the last game we saw that when this was the dynamic that cropped up, it was the more aggressive side that ended up victorious. But I do think that there are a few logistical issues that the more defensive side on that occasion ran into, where they made some missteps, I think, with committing ranged resources where they probably shouldn't have. On this occasion though, based on the fact that both red team armies bring relatively similar things to the table, I mean, they're bringing forward their Snaga archers, but they're going to need to move forward with some support for them as well. If they get too far ahead of the main army, they will be easy pickings for some counter cavalry charges from the blues. And if there's one thing the red team cannot allow, it's the blue team getting good value from their cavalry units. The red team have invested an awful lot of their money and army space into their cavalry. They need to dominate in that regard. Artillery even, infantry relatively even spread as well. There's more support units for the blue team, more in the way of javelins, obviously more in the way of archers as well. Really the only ranged support unit that the red team have are those heavy goblin crossbows. I guess you could count the javelins riding their wargs as well. Beasts of Gorgoroth are another wild card of a unit as well. Now the trebuchet starts to fire, the artillery duel begins, killing off some of the crew, but not able to hit the Mangonel. And again, interestingly enough, I mean, the Mangonel is not really something I would bother trying to get involved in an artillery duel with. I would probably just try and do some heavy damage with their exploding projectiles as quickly as I possibly could, because Mangonel's accuracy, even when you don't have the flaming shot on, is questionable. Also, the burning rain that the Mangonel tends to produce might actually be a better way of dealing with the Mangonel. It might be the only artillery piece in the game where you probably would have better luck in an artillery duel by utilising its flaming shot. The trebuchet is bouncing the projectile, they're bouncing over the hill, so offering a little bit of cover, and that's probably more in favour of the red team, honestly. Another hit into this line, not the most important of Mordor's units, but it's hits nonetheless. The blues, I think that hill, that little bit of terrain, which this map is significantly more barren than the other pitch battle map for the tournament that we've seen so far. This might be a little bit more like it. That was way up in the air, so we're probably only going to see the... That looked like a direct hit, 75% damage. There's more damage as well. Large explosions occurring. Forward come the Ardenheim shadow bows as well, and the Melkor's abominations. I mean, will the Misty Mountains react to this quickly enough? And so far the trebuchet shots have mostly skipped through the crew. I mean, for the most part, artillery crews are now more effective in melee. The only way that's true of the Goblin War Engine, though, is the fact that there's a lot of them, because they are standard Goblin infantry. Very, very low quality units indeed. And then come the Melkor's Abominations. No... Again, this is the sort of thing that I was concerned about. Real cover other than the 2 units of heavy goblin crossbows, which are fairly significant. They will do good damage to the Melkor's Abominations, and ultimately killing the Abominations off will give even more of a cavalry advantage to the red team, but that's only going to be worthwhile if you can actually truly utilise it late on. Flaming Shot now being utilised. Going to try and set fire to this Goblin War Engine. Hasn't been too effective so far, but they can't really take the chance that a couple of good hits right into the centre mass of their army could be absolutely devastating. I mean, the Bolgs Champion's going to try and get into the archers here. The archers last samuraiing them, and ultimately the Melkor's Abominations will blunt the charge. Yeah, and it actually managed to force the unit to turn around. The classic example of medieval 2 units being a bit sticky on some occasions. Not great for the Misty Mountains there. They're going to take hits from the Bolgs Champions on the retreat, although javelins coming in from the Warg Skirmishers. Interesting trades happening here. Melkor's Abominations a little bit isolated here, and yeah, they should indeed pull back. Lords of Anadune doing the same. Goblin War Engines taking damage. I kind of like the change that the artillery now doesn't instantly crumble. It means that an artillery duel is costly even if you end up winning it. So there is a school of thought where you just ignore the artillery duel and try and get the damage done to the enemy army as quickly as possible. Zardanaim Shadow Bows moving forwards. I mean, the Melkor's Abominations do have a fair amount of ground to try and cover. And they do manage to get into the Warg Skirmishers here, and the Abominations, like I said, if the red team are going to win this, they will need to dominate the cavalry game. And with lower resources so far, the blue team have done very, very well, and standard wargs like this do pretty poorly under arrow fire, especially with the kind of damage that rangers like the shadow bows are capable of chucking out. So they continue to fire. I mean, having a look elsewhere, the Bolgs Champions on the way forward once again, and the Melkor's Abominations are too far away this time. Oh no, they're close enough. Maybe not enough commitment there. I mean, the red team, based on their army, with their sweeping infantry and their numbers advantage, I would have thought they would have been better off trying to envelop the enemy and then, in the ensuing chaos, go after their support with their superior cavalry numbers. It's risky, of course. Well, it's not without its risks, but it's what their army is better set up for doing. In a tournament, though, like I said in the last battle, it does tend to be that players get a little bit more cautious. It's a little bit more than a casual game at that point. And that caution has resulted in some losses already. And it was more decisive actions in the second half of the battle that allowed the more aggressive team last time to be victorious. There's more open ground for them to use this time as well. We also need to get all of these phalanx units into melee. All of that armour piercing. Up close and personal. I do like the look of the composition of the blue team a little bit more, because they have more options. They're able to contest where the red team are strong, and with some good players we've already seen, they can actually gain some good ground in that regard. But they have other options as well. Plenty of good support, plenty of quality to fall back on. The wild card of the Beasts of Gorgoroth as well, whereas the red team, as has been the case in this tournament already, if Plan A fails, they don't have a great deal of other options. The Mangonel continuing to balloon its shots, getting very close to one of the Snaga archers firing away. I mean, interestingly enough, the Uruk halberds are actually a little bit in front of the Orc fodder, which is not the way around KURO would have wanted it. 2 extra kills onto those Uruk halberds certainly wouldn't go amiss for the red team to make up for the awkward nature of the incremental advance they've been doing so far. I did notice from afar as well that one of the mangonels has also fallen, or one of the war engines I should refer to them as. Still referred to as a mangonel when it's destroyed though, when its carcass is just lying there. The mangonel. So far, I mean, it's done damage, but as has been the case with artillery pretty much across the board in this tournament so far, certainly in the pitch battles, hasn't really done the business in the way they would have wanted. Lords of Anadune charging forward, and they will catch up with the Snaga here. If this were the crossbows backing up the Snaga archers, the Lords may have thought twice about that, but taking some arrow fire on the approach from the Snaga archers is really not the end of the world for them, given their impressive armour and shield stats and their second hit point. They will need to hot-foot it away from here though before the halberds drag them into a melee engagement. Those 2 units of Snaga archers do change up the dynamic of the range game a little bit, because certainly Numenor, they won't want to be using their ammunition on just any old garbage. The trebuchet actually taking some pot shots at the wargs, interestingly enough. The red team, I mean, especially with this movement from Mordor, now is the moment the red team really want to be trying to get into a good position. I mean, also the high ground could be taken by the Misty Mountain, such as it is. I mean, it's only a very small mound, but it does give them the ability to get their crossbows into a good position, and they can then take their pick of targets. Much more dangerous than the Snaga archers, of course. If they can get them into a good position, then it will be to the blue team's detriment here. As Mordor scurry forwards. So far just willing to accept the damage from the Snaga archers, which is fair enough. Not exactly the finest of units. Pharazim Swordmasters also, which we missed in the army composition phase, are a really dominating kind of unit. Outside of really the Hammer Guard only would give them pause, but even then, 1-to-1, the extra finesse from the Numenorians might be enough to carry them across the line. And now, maybe concentration of force here, spreading themselves so wide, the red team, that the blue team now moving in, the Warg Riders charging forwards, managing to get some good damage done to the Orc Javelins actually, but they're going to need to get out of there before they end up getting overrun by damage. Steel bows, and they're going to rout here. No way out. Uruk halberds catching them, and the Numenorian cohort doing the same. So what was initially a pretty good charge into Orc Javelins, but then they got a little bit greedy and hung around for too long, and it's ended up being a net loss for the red team there. We will be seeing more important engagements start to flare up now though, with Numenor and Mordor electing to charge headlong into Angmar, test the waters there, and if they can get in and amongst things and use their mass to buckle all of these phalanx units, Angmar's army will look significantly less effective. And if there's one thing that's very good at dealing with phalanx units, even halberdiers, it's going to be Olag High. You can see the Nazgul in the background there as well. The Misty Mountains cresting the hill just in the background though. If they can get in and amongst things, start really getting into the backfield of the blue team, that could be the difference maker. But they're going to need to be swift, because it's going to come down to how long Angmar can hold out for against this level of aggression. Also the Trolls of Angmar moving in, though as I've mentioned already, the lower reliance on phalanx units is going to be to the blue team's benefit here, but Trolls near to one another may yet end up butting heads. So far, more and more units arriving. There's a lot of phalanx units the Pharazim Swordmasters are having to deal with, and gaps are being found by stuff like the Wargs as well. So if the Misty Mountains can also do the same here, and their Wargs are in behind enemy lines, so I think we will have to go down at least temporarily to half speed. Witchram Inquisitors moving forward as well, so these are risky moments in the battle for the blue team. A few good charges overloading the flank as well with the entirety of the Misty Mountains infantry force, combined with the snow trolls, which have also revealed themselves from the composition phase. That could be how the Reds go on to win this. And in a pitch battle, it is always a little bit more risky to try and approach the battle in a more narrow capacity. The orcs are always going to try and spread out a bit more, try and utilise their numbers. It's whether or not there's elements of this envelopment that are of lower quality and end up buckling against the more elite forces of Numenor in particular, that may end up being a problem. In fact, in the Trebuchet crew, again, the artillery hasn't really been that decisive one way or the other. I would say it was a more significant investment of resources for Numenor, however. The infantry unit may very well be a little bit more useful in the long run as well, though. Warg Riders getting a good charge into the Seafarers. This, again, all of this support is pretty hideously exposed, but the wildcard unit, the Beasts of Gorgoroth, several of them falling away already, and again, a large part of that will be because of the heavy phalanx nature of Angmar. I mean, they have, you can see, disrupted Angmar a lot, so as much as they have taken losses, that was a worthwhile venture. Big damage being done. Angmar halberds actually managing to hold the trolls in a line engagement here, which is a bit of a rarity. Trolls usually just wade into lines with their sheer mass, but actually being held for a little bit there by the thin line of halberds, and actually being pushed back here, the trolls doing a good job. Probably the best example of a David and Goliath engagement on a field that we've seen. Lords of Anadune charging into the backfield, so doing some good damage aggressively with their own cavalry here. I think as the game has gone on, they found some good gaps, the red team rather. The blue team, though, not allowing utter cav dominance. It's turned into a real chaotic time of it now. You can see the Misty Mountains now wheeling around. This will be the ultimate litmus test of the blue team's qualities. Minas Morgul chosen, or just Morgul chosen actually. One of the backstops, but it's a lot of goblins and black uruks that are going to be wheeling around their backlines here. They're going to need to break the back of the Angmar assault and then turn all of those other units around. The Beasts of Gorgoroth have proven to be a very significant pick, I think. If the blue team are to go on to win this, it will be as a result of their impact. You can see, though, they do fall away far more quickly than the Mumakil under pressure. The javelins being thrown, incremental damage being added on top as well. Defeat still seems certain so far. The phalanx approach of Angmar has helped them hold out. I mean, it's utter bedlam in this engagement over here, which Angmar would have been hoping for something a little bit more ordered. They just need to keep more of the strength tied up over here and allow the Misty Mountains to keep picking away at the back line, I think, and then the red team should go on to be victorious. Moria halberds taking hits. Sort of in the shadow of the hill over here, this battle is taking shape. Morgul chosen getting overwhelmed though. White uruks being joined by the black uruks. Halberds and two-handed swords. Heavy goblin crossbows who haven't set up on the hilltop. It's very difficult to keep track of this kind of unit as a game goes along. Heavy violence though. I mean, still this battle very much in the balance. You get the sense that it's going to tip one way or the other pretty quickly. I think Angmar have ultimately fallen apart. It's only the snow trolls of the Misty Mountains, ironically enough, over here. That gamble to go and take the offensive option against Angmar could yet pay off for Mordor and Numenor, as the rest of their force is now turning around to front up against the Misty Mountains. Their rearguard has held on for a long enough period of time to open this possibility up, but there's a good amount of two-handed swordsmen they're having to deal with. I mean, there is the small matter as well of the Blackback Mountain Berserkers to deal with. They will be capable of dishing out the pain to even the best of Numenor. There goes our Pharazôn as well, poked to death by one of the White Uruk fearmongers. Still a few Angmarim units roaming around the fields as well. Orc fodder and Uruk halberds moving across Numenorian cohorts. Very fine margins this battle could be decided upon. Iron shadow bows flinging a couple of flaming arrows in, which, I mean, Misty Mountains are susceptible to a good mass rout, although they seem to be getting some more friendly fire into the back of the Morgul Chosen here, so not ideal for them. There's still a few beasts of Gorgoroth around. A bit more of a disruptive influence could have the same effect on the Misty Mountains, or at least portions of the Misty Mountains, although there goes the Mordor general. Oh no, that's the Angmar general, isn't it? So the Angmar general being finished off, the Hammer Guard getting bullied by the Steel Bowmen in the backfield. That will be enough to finish them off, although that really is a footnote of an engagement. I think the most important engagement, honestly, is the one happening over here. The Troll Drummers keeping Mordor pointing in the right direction. The Olag High, the Beasts of Gorgoroth, and the Nazgul. Yeah, the Guardians of Khan Doom, Angmar being finished off, and I think ultimately the Misty Mountains are not going to have the level of quality when Mordor and Numenor group up. And I think we will see them slowly start to fall away, and the blue team ultimately victorious here. Just in behind the Moria halberds. The White Turret Fearmongers. I mean, the phalanx-based approach of the red team here has made their infantry pretty resilient, even in the face of some examples of quality. But also, when you have that kind of army, you want it to be a little bit more of a structured battle. For the Orcs, of course, they do tend to like a bit of chaos, but ordered chaos, I think, would have been the order of the day here. Keeping the enemy bottled up in the middle of a giant mosh pit was probably the best outcome for the red team, and ultimately it ended up being a little bit more of a mass brawl than that, which favoured the blue team a little bit more with their infantry, and also stuff like the trolls and the elephants, the beasts of Gorgoroth in the background. And ultimately, I'll give my full thoughts in the closing splash screen, but again, I think it's aggression and willingness to commit quickly which has ultimately won the game for the blue team, even though they had overall the more initially defensive approach. When the time came, they were decisive in a way that maybe the red team were not, guilty of dragging their heels just a little bit too much. And by those fine margins, I think their goblins are going to start to quit the field in high numbers fairly quickly here. Defeat a distinct possibility. Still javelins moving in. I mean, on a pitch battle, it's a little bit more difficult to get your supporting units in to play in a more orderly fashion, and we've certainly seen that here. I mean, crossbows, artillery, archers, javelins even, all of them have been asked to work under circumstances not ideal, but I think they can still afford to be pretty pleased with how this has gone. Moria halberdiers, still the Beasts of Gorgoroth. Only 2 remain, but certainly a big factor in this battle. They were able to break up Angmar quickly enough, and they were on a ticking clock. They needed to bust that Angmar infantry line wide open before the Misty Mountains arrived to complete the encirclement, and they were able to do that ultimately. And there's still a lot of these Olagai left alive. Again, that's really one area where that phalanx, especially from Angmar, the huge phalanx focus they had, was always going to be a little bit of a problem against something like Olag High. They needed their wargs to charge in, or their Hammer Guard to do the damage, and ultimately the Hammer Guard were in a separate part of the line. The wargs were, rightly I think, going after the blue team's support, but it is what it is ultimately. It's a close run thing. I mean, in terms of sheer numbers, there's still a fair number of the Misty Mountains left alive, but so many of them are very low tier and gonna rout in the face of this kind of army. What we see before us though here in this group, as well as those 18 steel bows, are all that really remains of the blues, and all that remains of the reds really, and their artillery. Mordor Chosen finishing off a few units, still 11 Nazgul. The heavy hitting Mordor units of the Nazgul and the Olag High in melee. A real fixture for Mordor. Numenor's baseline level of quality played a part, but actually I do think Mordor were the most decisive factor in this battle today. The beasts, the Olag High in particular. Nazgul still healthy come the late game as well, but in quicker pitch battles like this, then the Nazgul will either be the last one standing for Mordor, or they'll end up pretty healthy in the long run. There we have it. A victory for the blue team. Fairly narrow. But like I said, I think the main difference here was if the red team had showed a little bit more faith in their own approach, actually, I think I would put it as, they probably would have been able to win this. I think if the Misty Mountains had been in position to wrap around the blue team a little bit more quickly than they were able to, I think that would have been the difference. But ultimately the Angmar line buckled under its pressure a little bit too soon for the Misty Mountains to really be able to complete that encirclement, and that ultimately made the difference, I think. And like I said, if they were willing to just push forward a little bit more quickly, but again, a tournament, it does weird things to people, I think. It makes them just a little bit overcautious, and more often than not, it's actually quite pleasing to see in a way that overcaution has been punished pretty much every time it's come up in the tournament so far. But I don't want to take anything away from KURO and SYNN, because I think the decision to actually be aggressive in the first place was born of the fact that they noticed the Misty Mountains were lagging behind a little bit, and they knew what was coming. They knew that they couldn't really cover every angle, so they needed to do something quickly. They went on the attack against Angmar, and it ended up paying off for them, and ultimately saw them through. And like I said, I think in particular we will be able to see it, I think, because this was from KURO's perspective, but there were some very good individual unit performances from Mordor, which ultimately ended up being the difference. But also, you know, the baseline level of quality that Numenor had, plenty of javelin support. There was really nothing Numenor had that in melee was going to be a pushover, which is a bit of a problem when you're talking about trying to envelop with regular Moria halberds and goblin infantry and Snagar archers having to muck in melee as well. So let's see what did the business. The Nazgul, 90 kills, but yeah, the Beasts of Gorgoroth and the Olag High, the two big performers here, in particular the Beasts of Gorgoroth. The level of disruption, like Angmar probably would have been able to hold out, or definitely would have been able to hold out long enough for the Misty Mountains to do their thing, had it not been for the Beasts of Gorgoroth. So stark contrast really to the Mumakil. The Mumakil were on the winning team last time around, but didn't really do a whole lot throughout the battle, really. It was just their presence which dictated things, whereas here, practical applications of what the elephants can do when they're allowed to get up to full tilt, really. Good performance from the Uruk halberds as well, trading effectively with their opposite numbers. Ardenheim shadowbows also did a good thing. Orc javelins, they got charged really by cavalry, but you know, it's one of those situations where cheap javelins like this are always going to do something for you, even if it's not anything too significant. They will play a part. Morgul chose as well, doing the business, and fodder ultimately just there to die. Anyway, so yeah, the right victor here, decisive moves, good to see. And yeah, another tournament. So I think this was the decisive battle in this particular series as well, which, like I said, I'm going to be trying to show those when it comes to the initial round. So for the most part, they're going to be pitch battles, midweek battles. As a result of the tournament going on, though, one thing that has, or is very likely to be the case, is most of the active players are likely to be doing their tournament games rather than the set-piece siege battles. So it's going to be interesting to see how the schedule shakes up. I mean, there are a few things I can fiddle around with as well in terms of other videos, but again, we'll see. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. But yeah, hopefully on Wednesdays these tournament pitch battles will be a bit of a regular occurrence here. But yeah, congratulations to KURO and SYNN, good win. Commiserations to Katragon and SAI PHANI, who were very close actually to pulling out the victory here. It was very, very fine margins, just a little bit quicker on the draw, and they could very well have won this one. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.